The Ottoman Empire lasted for 600 years and dominated the Middle East and Europe, from Budapest to Baghdad and everything in between. Its sultans ruled 3 continents, but they didn't do it on their own. This podcast looks at the cast of characters who made the empire run: the sultan, the queen mother, the harem eunuch, the merchant, the peasant, the janissary, the holy man, and the outlaw. Welcome to Ottoman Lives. On September 21st, 1797, the Ottoman governor of Rumelia, or the European side of the empire, Mustafa Pasha, reported to Sultan Selim III that he, his imperial forces, and the local community were in a dangerous situation that could escalate into a large-scale conflict in the city of Filibe in Bulgaria. The official claimed that he had successfully co-opted the mountain bandit leader Kara Feyzi. He also co-opted his companions and their bands and rolled them up into his own forces. He settled them in the Balkans and said he was on the cusp of ending their 5-year-long reign of pillaging that had devastated much of the region. But Mustafa Pasha then complained that his plans went askew by another Ottoman officer. The governor of Anatolia, Ali Pasha, marched his troops into the outskirts of Filibe and attacked his divisions that included the bandit Kara Feyzi, and completely disregarded Mustafa Pasha's pledges of amnesty given to these bandit leaders and their men. But then the Anatolian governor added insult to injury by doing some of his own pillaging. He indiscriminately plundered properties and slaughtered bystanders. Mustafa Pasha continued his letter and noted that local inhabitants were now talking about how it was his failure to uphold his word of honor of amnesty for the former bandits that led to their suffering. As a consequence, the pardoned bandits and local inhabitants were rumored to be on the verge of a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. Well, the Anatolian governor, Ali Pasha, wrote his own letter to the Sultan denying all charges. 2 days later, he accused Mustafa Pasha of spreading false rumor about what actually happened in Filibe, and this began a heated exchange of conflicting accounts that drew in governors from all over the empire. Was the Ottoman army indiscriminately attacking people who received amnesty? Were they not doing that? Were inhabitants joining ranks with the bandits? Were the bandits returning to their old lives of plundering? This was getting really confusing. Ali Pasha, the governor of Anatolia, went so far as to charge that not only was Rumelian governor Mustafa Pasha too soft on former bandits and personally bargaining with dangerous men that he couldn't control, but that, according to local rumor, Mustafa Pasha's administration was in cahoots with these criminals. Ali Pasha wrote further letters stating that only a powerful and trustworthy person like himself could clean up this web of deceit and drain the swamp. Okay, well, who was this bandit leader that they were talking about? Kara Feyzi. Kara Feyzi achieved notoriety for leading a pillaging enterprise that crossed boundaries and spread all over the Balkans, into Bulgaria, into Macedonia, and other places, and recruited many former soldiers. Thousands of veterans were left without work after the Habsburg-Ottoman-Russian War of 1788 to 1792. These soldiers joined the ranks of the bandit Kara Feyzi, and their operations spread throughout the Ottoman Balkans in Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Macedonia, Greece, and Turkey. Kara Feyzi had no official title or fixed seat of power, and this is why he hasn't shown up in Ottoman sources until very recently, with the work of such scholars as Tolga Esmer, who is my advisor. But Kara Feyzi operated a powerful mobile bandit network that operated throughout the Balkans. And there's a reason why he doesn't show up in a lot of chronicles, and his story was whitewashed, and that's because of his operation's success and ability to deceive imperial officials time and time again. He was a huge embarrassment to the government. But Kara Feyzi's story demonstrates that there were other players between the provinces in Istanbul, besides local notables and renegade imperial officials. That's because the Ottoman government relied upon bandit networks for different reasons. The leaders of these networks fulfilled important functions in Ottoman politics and government, even if the Ottoman government and other imperial powers labeled such men as irregulars and bandits. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Ottoman bandit. And as you can see here, this is a confusing subject to talk about because there's not a clear line between bandit and legitimate government representative. In order to explain what I'm talking about, I want to introduce a concept called a monopoly of violence. This is an idea from political science and a core concept of public law, which goes back to Thomas Hobbes' book, Leviathan. And what it means is that the state is the only institution that lays claim to the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. So from a government's perspective, you can only kill people legally if you're in the army, if you're a member of the police, if you're an executioner, you're some sort of government official. The government doesn't allow blood feuds or family feuds between clans in the mountains because government representatives aren't doing the killing. Before the modern period, the state did not have a monopoly on violence. For example, in the Middle Ages, private warfare was permitted under certain conditions. A baron or a lord could engage in private warfare, and religious courts had sole jurisdiction over some types of offenses, like heresy or sex crimes. But in the modern era, the state exists wherever a single authority can legitimately authorize violence. The Ottoman Empire didn't get to the point where it had enough control that could maintain a monopoly on violence, and sometimes it used bandit networks for its own ends. The Ottoman government was happy to allow bandits into their ranks when they were useful. For example, the most successful sea captain in Ottoman history was Hayrettin Barbarossa. He was an Ottoman admiral of the fleet who scored major victories for the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s and allowed them to have dominance over the Mediterranean. But before he was a captain, he was a privateer, or some would say pirate, in the Mediterranean, who fought against the Knights Hospitaller, who were based on the island of Rhodes. And I've done previous podcast episodes about the history of the mafia in the United States, in Japan, in many other places. And the point is that even in the modern era, the state doesn't have complete monopoly on violence. The Yakuza in Japan, for example, in many situations exist parallel with the government, and the government of Japan informally gives them jurisdiction over different areas. In fact, that's where the mafia comes from. In Sicily, the Italian government really didn't consolidate control, and when there was a black hole of security for locals, the mafia filled this in. They provided justice to people who asked for it. The lines between legitimate government and illegitimate government had not consolidated, and this is the situation the Ottoman Empire constantly finds itself in. Well, let's get back to the story of Kara Feyzi. The reason the different government officials were trying to co-opt him and his band is because they wanted to go after an even bigger bandit, and that was Pasbanzadeh Osman Pasha. And the Ottoman government wanted to co-opt or destroy Kara Feyzi's bands in southern Rumelia because they wanted to attack Osman Pasha. The government in Istanbul thought that he was the patron and the mastermind of all the bandit networks in the Balkans. But these networks were spread out and mostly operated independently, and their goals and their alliances and their loyalties constantly shifted. Well, Kara Feyzi himself had considerable influence on large groups throughout the Balkans, especially in Filibe in Bulgaria and other nearby towns. But Kara Feyzi had close relations with many other imperial officials in the empire, and was even given honorific titles later in life when the government attempted to co-opt him. All right, so that's a little background on Ottoman banditry. Let me just telescope out a little bit and talk about it according to the wider themes of what's happening in the empire at this time. Banditry in the Ottoman Empire resulted from changes in the state's military and fiscal organization and the empire's integration into the world economy from the 16th century onward, when the Ottoman Empire conquers a lot of southeastern Europe, but also comes to trade extensively with European governments. Bandit groups consisted of mercenaries, former soldiers, nomads, and peasants. After a war was over, you weren't given any sort of military pension or benefits. You were simply dumped jobless back into the empire. If you didn't have a job but you knew how to fight war, then banditry could become an excellent occupation and probably one of the quickest paths to wealth. Also, if you were semi-nomadic and constantly moved around from place to place, as hundreds of thousands of people were in the Ottoman Empire, evading government forces was second nature to you. In the earlier episode, I talked about the military organization of the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire's classical period, cavalry soldiers, or sipahi, held a military fief. They farmed this land, they collected taxes, and they were expected to perform military service in return. This system formed the backbone of the Ottoman army, and most of the military expenses were met by way of timar assignments, through the collection of state taxes by the cavalryman from land plots assigned to them in the provinces. During the 16th century, each military campaign caused a growth in the number of troops in the Ottoman Empire. As a result, the state treasury was frequently in need of ready cash for the military's upkeep, especially in times of war. So the government was faced with the major task of reorganizing state finances to meet the needs of changing times. But major changes came about in the 1580s due to the decay of the Tamar system, where these land plots came under direct control of the state treasury. Once under government control, most of the Tamar revenues were farmed out by iltizam. Iltizam was a type of tax farming, where the government sold these tax collection rights to wealthy notables, who would then reap up to 5 times the amount they had paid by taxing peasants and extracting agricultural production. It was a system that was very profitable to the aristocracy and helped create a large and powerful elite. This system was eventually abolished in the 19th century, but not before doing considerable damage. With all this exploitation going on, there were many dissatisfied subjects who didn't think too much about rebelling against the government. Military reorganization also led to the rise in banditry. The treasury tried to reduce the expenditure on armed forces stationed in the provinces, and more governors were expected to provide and pay for their own military retinues. Anatolian mercenary networks began to be maintained by local governors as part of their retinues. Therefore, a sizable number of armed bands roamed the Anatolian countryside in search of employment. Moreover, in order to survive, they did shakedowns and exacted illegal taxes from peasants, in spite of the government's attempts to secure its tax base and protect peasants. So in this context, the mercenaries who became vagrant during peace, and the peasants exploited by increased arbitrary tax burdens, started to engage in banditry in the Ottoman countryside. The Jalali rebellions of the 16th century emerged in this context as a threat to the central authority. At the end of this century, certain leaders of mercenary troops were able to cross all over Anatolia and set siege to major fortified towns. But Jalali leaders, whose main pretext for rebellion was the need to feed their mercenaries, could be integrated back into the system of the government, where they were given public office. And once they were co-opted, the need for rebellion disappeared. So the Ottoman Empire was very pragmatic and always willing to co-opt bandits back into the government if that could put things down. Well, there was another major period of banditry, and that was in the 19th century. The destruction of the Janissary troops in 1826, which we talked about in an earlier episode, and Sultan Mahmud II's efforts to create a general conscription system led to the increase of banditry across the empire. Former Janissaries continued their careers as bandits, and the subjects who faced for the first time the direct control of the central state began to desert and join the bandit groups. Many people weren't too excited about conscription into the military, especially after the Ottoman-Russian War of 1828 to 1829. Soldiers who could return to their homelands in search of employment often became bandits. Moreover, the conquest of Algeria by France in the 1830s caused the unemployment of young people who were sent regularly to Algeria from Izmir. They found refuge with bandits active in the hinterland of Izmir, or Smyrna, which is located on the Mediterranean. Fiscal transformation in the Ottoman government in the 1800s led to further development of banditry in the Ottoman provinces. Peasants who faced the new taxation structure and notables who lost their ancient privileges resisted the military and fiscal centralization attempts of government reform efforts. During the 1840s and 1850s, the government couldn't even collect taxes imposed in regions close to Istanbul. Banditry intensified, especially in the second half of the 19th century in Anatolia, and bandits essentially controlled the government in those regions. The government, which couldn't prevent banditry and was in need of soldiers, forgave them in return that they join the army and that they fight in the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877 to 1878. The bandits accepted the offer, but after the war they continued their usual activities of the region. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. This description here shows you how much chaos the Ottoman government was in the 19th century. Fairly or unfairly, many Europeans called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, and they thought it was a question of if, not when, the empire would crumble. So something that Ottoman historians have had to fight against for a long time is called the decline thesis, where from basically the 1700s to the end of the empire in 1923, it was on a terminal decline, and everything that happens can only be seen through the prism of decline, Well, historians have tried to fight against that because that's too deterministic, but you can't argue that there were a lot of problems happening. Another big problem with bandits was all the kidnappings that they did. That's because the integration of the Ottoman lands into the world economy also agitated Ottoman subjects in the countryside. Foreigners appeared in increased numbers and engaged in more economic activity in this period, and they were a ripe target for bandits, especially in the less well-policed countryside. The usual method was to kidnap people and release them in exchange for a ransom, sort of like in cartel-controlled parts of Mexico or Colombia. Between 1880 and 1902, a large portion of these kidnappings occurred in the province of Aydin, the majority of these in or near Izmir. For example, a German man by the name of Fritz Charnaud was kidnapped on September 21, 1885, and was released on a ransom of 1,500 Turkish lira. 18,000 had at first been demanded. RCH and W.J. Wilkin and O. Whittle were kidnapped on September 24, 1887 near Izmir. One captive was released, and the ransom finally agreed upon was 800 lira. A French railway entrepreneur, M. Waligorski, was captured by a gang of 5 men in August 1896, but he was released within 24 hours against a ransom of 4,000 Turkish lira paid by the company. And there are many other kidnappings that occurred of other European officials who were working in industry and banking and commerce on railway lines, as military instructors, anything you could imagine. And there were also plenty of brigand gangs and leaders in the Anatolian countryside. Banditry had probably always existed in rural western Anatolia, and brigands were very active in the second half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. The most notorious Turkish bandit leaders of the time were Çakırcalı Ahmed, who was killed in December 1883, and Çakırcalı Mehmet, who reportedly acted as a sort of Robin Hood, who, what he liked to claim, robbed the rich while distributing booty among the poor. The government couldn't suppress his activities and tried to pacify him and his gang by offering a fixed annual income and gave him land and a monthly salary of 20 Turkish lira. In October 1909, he was reportedly arrested, and this was certainly not true because he finally died in a surprise attack by government troops in the mountains near Milos in 1911. His cousin succeeded him as a gang leader. And it wasn't just Turkish people, of course, who were bandits. There were also Greek bandits, Albanian bandits. For example, bandit leaders Gorgios and Demos, who operated in the regions of Bornova, were active near Izmir. The Dutch consulate had an impression that these and other gangs of brigands had divided the whole province among themselves. Part of the reason that there was so much banditry in the early 20th century was because of bad harvests due to drought and the increased tax burden from the government. So plundering of wagons loaded with grain and other foodstuffs was common. Bandits on land was a main feature of the Ottoman Empire, but we can't overlook bandits at sea, or as they're called, pirates. Piracy was practiced throughout history in the Mediterranean, going back into the Roman Empire, the medieval period, and definitely from the 1500s onward, the late 1500s, when the Ottoman Empire no longer had a monopoly of control. There was constant vying between the Ottomans, the Knights of St. John, other Crusader knights in Malta and Rhodes, the Italian city-states, Spanish powers, and pirates all over the place. Along the Mediterranean shores, the stony soil and dryness of the region has always encouraged poor inhabitants to try their luck at sea and make their money there, and the many islands scattered across the Mediterranean provided safe harbor and concealment. But piracy isn't just about outlaws. The Ottomans drew on the knowledge and skills of pirates when they first reached the shores of the Mediterranean in the mid-14th century. In the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were horseback-mounted, nomadic warriors. They didn't know anything about the sea, so they had to draw in outside expertise. They had little maritime knowledge and no proper navy, so Ottoman sultans engaged pirates, mostly Greeks, to carry out raids against various enemies, who were, of course, doing the same thing. Among these was Hydrichin Barbarossa, a Greek convert from Christianity to Islam, who was from a Greek island, and one of the famed Barbarossa brothers, who began as a raider for the Ottomans, and eventually took the fight to the western Mediterranean, and rose through the Ottoman ranks to become Admiral-in-Chief of the Ottoman Navy in 1533. When a pirate fought on behalf of a state, in most parts of the world he was known as a privateer. In the Mediterranean, there was the less familiar figure of a corsair. The corsair, who fought a battle known as the Corso, is something between a pirate and a privateer. These terms originate in Italy, but were adapted across the Mediterranean because they're a reflection of certain realities there. The term came out in the 12th century when antagonism between Christianity and Islam was ignited by the First Crusade. The term corsair had a religious connotation. To be a Christian corsair was to be a warrior engaged with the battle against Islam, and for a Muslim corsair, it was vice versa. Because this war between Christianity and Islam was considered perennial by many, at least in the minds of combatants, so too was the phenomena of the corsair. So corsairing wasn't limited to periods of declared war, but was a permanent feature of Mediterranean life. And corsairs often had a closer association with the state than was seen in other parts of the world. So you could claim the religious mantle and be promoted from pirate or bandit to corsair if you could legitimate your aims in a holy war and your activities serve the interests of the government, of course. In the 16th century, when navies on both the Ottoman and the Spanish side engaged in a number of large-scale sea battles, corsairs were enveloped into the organized fighting forces of internationally recognized governments. But toward the end of the century, the Ottomans and the Spanish signed a peace treaty and both turned their attention elsewhere. These corsairs were now without the material opportunities that warfare had provided, and corsairs emerged on both sides of the religious divide. And you even see the rise of corsair states. These are governments that were organized for and lived off the profits of raiding at sea. So the Barbary states of North Africa come out of this. This is why the 17th century is known as the Age of the Corsair in the Mediterranean. The most notorious Christian corsairs were the Knights of St. John on the island of Malta. And in an earlier episode of this podcast, I talked about the Siege of Malta, why it's important, and why after the battle ends, this leads to the Golden Age of piracy. On the Muslim side, the three North African corsair states of Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis became infamous raiders on Christian shipping. And I did a 5-part series on slavery on this podcast, and one whole episode was about Muslim pirates who would kidnap and capture European villagers on Italian coasts, on Spanish coasts, and would get all the way up to Ireland. So you had upwards of hundreds of thousands of European Christians who were captured and sold into slavery in North Africa. The relationship between these corsair states of North Africa and their connection to the Ottoman Empire was very ambiguous. Very loosely speaking, they were part of the Ottoman Empire, but that's a stretch to say so. The corsair states nominally acknowledged the Ottomans as their sovereigns, but really operated independently. Now, the Ottomans benefited from North African maritime skill, and more than one Ottoman admiral rose through the ranks from these corsairs. But in the 17th century, the corsairs became a nuisance to established governments because they preyed on the shipping of countries such as France and England that were officially at peace with the Ottoman Sultan. And as European maritime technology rises by the early 1800s, they're able to eventually destroy these Barbary states. But until then, these attacks provoke complaints by the English or French ambassadors in Istanbul. But the Ottomans, despite their assurances to the contrary, were never able to rein in the North Africans. The ability of the corsairs to terrorize peaceful commercial shipping in the name of either Islam or Christianity was due to the inability of larger governments to impose order at sea. But over time, as the navies of the French and English grew in strength, they were able to rein in the corsairs, and in the 18th century saw a marked lessening in such activity. Corsair raiding flared up again during the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. Although both Christians and Muslims always engaged in maritime violence, France was able to selectively highlight North African corsairing as a justification for the invasion of Algeria in 1830, which led to 130 years of occupation. The European rhetoric at the time insisted that the Algerians were pirates and completely avoided the term corsair because they didn't want to give them any legitimacy. But the power of the corsair waned, especially after the Barbary Wars in the early 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson raised up the United States Navy to crush the Barbary pirates because they had taken Americans captive. The Corsairs were very happy to go after Americans because they had signed a peace treaty with England, and America didn't have a sizable navy to speak of, so they were easy pickings and great to exploit for new slaves or hold wealthier captives for ransom. But when they were crushed by the American Navy and pirates simply could not keep up the arms race against naval technology of France, England, and the United States, the strength of Corsairs diminished. Once they were no longer a terrorizing threat, they became mythologized and romanticized, especially by writers in the early 1800s in England and other places in Europe. The place of the Corsair was enshrined in Western literature by the widely read English Romantic poem, The Corsair, by Lord Byron in 1814. So the Ottoman bandit might not seem like that big of a deal to us, but in some ways, the occupation of Algeria was due to Ottoman banditry at sea, and Ottoman bandits frequently destabilized the government, but in many times as well, they were legitimate parts of the government and sometimes the most powerful members of the government. So these lines were very porous. Well, that's all for this episode, and this was the final episode in this series on Ottoman lives. Thanks for sharing this with me. I finally get to use my Ottoman expertise for something. I hope you enjoyed this series. If you would like me to do other specific series like this, I am always open to your suggestions. Thanks for listening to this episode. For more information, including show notes, maps, and a bibliography, go to OttomanLives.com. Also, if you like this show, please rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. It helps us grow the show and make it easier for new listeners to discover us. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.